What is the relationship between language and the self? Chants of Sennaar is a language-based puzzle game where you encounter different cultures and languages with the goal of learning how to communicate with everybody. If you haven't played it yet, it's a solid 8 to 10 hours of great gameplay. I would give it a strong recommend, and I don't like puzzle games. It's on Xbox Game Pass, so it's basically free for a monthly payment. I won't be spoiling any solutions or plot points here, so it's safe to continue down this rabbit hole with me. Chants of Sennaar looks at language at the societal level, and the relationship between language and society is a necessary one because without language that you all speak, you can't be a society. If you can't communicate, you can't be together. Duh. Language is the glue that then would hold society together. Apart from the obvious connection between language and society and communication, there are more subtle ways that language may influence a culture. This is called linguistic relativism, the idea that language has a power to change your perception. And there are some examples of this. This has been debated for the last couple hundred years. There's different levels of agreement on how much does language change your perception? But there are some obvious examples that we can look at how different cultures would perceive the same objects or perceive values. It comes down to whether or not language is what is causing that perception, or culturally the perception exists and language is just a reflection of that. Think of the difference between English and Spanish. Spanish has a formal and an informal tense. You speak differently, you conjugate your verbs differently depending on the personal relationship that you have or don't have with the other person. So if you're talking to a family member, you use tú, which is the informal you. If you're talking to a stranger or someone that you're a teacher or something, you would use usted, which is the very formal, like sir, ma'am in English. So built into the language, you have this closeness and formality. You can see that Spanish cultures also have a really strong family value set. They live together, whereas in English-speaking cultures, you're kind of kicked out of the nest as soon as maybe even before you're self-sufficient, right? You go to college, you're done. In Spanish-speaking countries, in broad strokes, the family will stick together and you'll have multi-generation families living in the same household. The big question is that a result of the language changing or manifesting their cultural values, or do their cultural values that have been passed down traditionally manifest in language? Chants of Sennaar takes this at a caricature level, not in a derogatory sense. Just at the beginning, you can see two groups of people interacting. One clearly is a group of soldiers. You can see that the language that they're speaking is very angular, very jagged, very harsh, versus the robed people. Their language isn't so harsh, they look demure. Their language reflects that. As you progress through Chants of Sennaar, you see different languages being a reflection of the people. And while Chants of Sennaar will investigate the role of language between societies, the role of language within society, while playing the game, I couldn't help but think about the role of language in the individual, specifically the role of language in identifying and creating your sense of self. Your sense of self would also be called your ego. It is the I in I am sitting here recording a video. I am sitting here enjoying a video. There has been a lot of philosophical investigation into what is the self? What is the mind? Are they separate? Are they the same? Does it even exist? These are all part of the discussion around the mind. And I'm going to focus my thoughts today on how language itself creates the scaffolding and the structure upon which your self can develop. The first real mention of mind in the philosophical text that we have is with the pre-Socratic philosophers, namely Parmenides. Nuts. So Parmenides, he was born about 515 BC. He was really one of the first ones that we can identify that gave a definition or an explanation of the mind. What is it? How does it work? What is it made out of? For Parmenides, the mind and the soul are the same thing. So if it's living, it has a mind. Whether it's a cat, an ant, a person, there's some level of rationality that is innate to being. Perception itself, in this case, would be considered thinking. based on that definition, it's easily applied to even the basest of animals who can perceive their surroundings. At some level, they are thinking. He even came up with the idea that soul is a mixture between earth and fire. Don't know what that's all about. Nowadays, it's like, okay, that's not right. But a lot of the other stuff is really interesting. Every being at some level has cognition because that is perception. Nowadays, we would kind of position that as consciousness as itself. And when I say consciousness, I mean the ability for you to perceive your surroundings, not necessarily your thinking mind, but the mind that feels the cold in the room, the mind that feels your tongue on the roof of your mouth, the mind that is experiencing things at just the most fundamental level. The idea of the self then would be something over and above that consciousness. Parmenides doesn't get much into the nuance of language or the self or the ego, but for a historical context, this is where mind first sprouts, an explanation of what mind is. And what's important is that later thinkers are going to be responding to what Parmenides says, and eventually thinkers like Descartes, Kant. All future philosophy of mind stems from Parmenides. Now I'm just going to rush forward a few thousand years because I want to, and start in with Descartes, who lived from 1596 to 1650. He's super well known. He's the I think therefore I am guy. He was a philosopher, scientist, cat torturer. You know, a real Renaissance man. And what he was thinking about, one of his pivotal works, the source of I Think Therefore I Am, is Meditations on First Philosophy. Or the full title, which gives some insight into what his purpose was in writing this, is Meditations on First Philosophy, in which the existence of God and the distinction between the soul and the body are demonstrated. We still are locked into the mind/soul being the same, that it is separate from the body. As far as subdivisions within the soul/mind, much like consciousness and the self, we don't really see that yet. That's not part of what Descartes is doing here. Descartes takes the consciousness as developed by Parmenides and sets that aside. Perception isn't necessarily thinking for Descartes. It's one of the first things to go in his elimination meditations. Whenever we're talking about him not really considering consciousness on its own, his idea of thinking is the more active version of thinking. Perception is left to the senses. What he is doing is trying to identify first philosophy, which is metaphysics, which you can kind of think about as the existence of concepts, like the existence of things outside of the physical realm. That's why it's metaphysics or beyond physics. So not of this world, it's like of being itself. And he does this through something called the elimination method, where he starts from a position of, well, I have believed in a lot of incorrect things all my life, and I've corrected those incorrect beliefs, but I still had them, so I can doubt what I thought was true. I am not perfect at identifying what is real, what is true, and what is false and fake. I need to start eliminating those things that I have even a shred of doubt about, so that I can get to the one kernel of truth, if it does exist, and then I can build from there. I can find my foundation and then build off of that truth. Because if I have built a whole philosophy, if I've built a whole series of what I assume to be truths on a fundamental lie, then the whole thing just collapses. It's like the conception of the solar system before the heliocentric model was proposed and accepted. If you believe that the Earth is at the middle of everything and you build your science on that, then everything collapses. What Descartes is trying to do is, in a philosophical sense, identify if truth is even possible. He works his way through an elimination method in this meditation, first casting off his beliefs, casting off, well, my senses. I've seen things that I have gotten closer and realized that I didn't see them correctly, so my senses are flawed. I have to get rid of that. I have to get rid of my physical self because I doubt that that even exists. And he starts working and eliminating every facet of his being until he's left with almost nothing. I mean, it's dramatized, of course, but he says that he is terrified that, wow, I made it to the bottom and there's nothing here. However, he comes to the realization that, well, something has been convinced of something. I believe that I have been persuaded in something. Essentially, the only thing I know for certain is that I am a thing that thinks. I am a thinking thing because I can be persuaded. My sense of self, my soul, is this kernel of truth upon which I can build everything else. And that's where you get, I think, therefore I am. In a world where you must distrust everything, even what your eyes tell you, even what you believe, the idea that you are a thing that can be persuaded by either truth or fiction, truth or lies, well, even though what you're convinced of might not necessarily be true, there is still something innate that can be convinced of something, and that is true existence. And this is the seed that other thinkers are then going to build on, that you do have this soul, this mind. This can be seen as a universal truth that applies to everyone, except for the fact that it doesn't. This is where other thinkers are going to come and develop on this idea in their own way, much like Kant with his manifold. Kant was born in 1724 and died in 1804, so he's not too far after Descartes and I think therefore I am. However, he takes a much more complex and difficult path in describing consciousness. In fact, in Critiques of Pure Reason, his main objective isn't necessarily describing the self or consciousness. It's ancillary to his overall goal of trying to prove that physics is as good as math as an a priori concept. A priori meaning that it is true whether or not there is existence. So with math, 1 + 1 is 2 would be an a priori concept because that is true independent of anything else. That when you take one thing and put it with another thing, you have two of that thing. Whereas if I'm looking at the sky and I say the sky is blue, that would be a posteriori because it requires existence in order for it to be true. You have to experience it and then know, oh, the sky is blue, rather than it being a universal truth that is true independent of existence. Kant is trying to justify physics as a priori, and this would be kind of in the same vein as Descartes, the foundation upon which science can be built, trying to identify what is the absolute truth of physics. And in that very lengthy and very nuanced discussion, he elucidates some aspects of consciousness, some aspects of the self. Kant uses a functionalistic approach in describing the mind, where consciousness and the self are both combined. What is a functionalistic approach? Well, imagine you're cutting your way through the woods and all of a sudden you find this massive structure. As you investigate this structure, you find that water enters on one side, spins a turbine and exits, and that spinning of the turbine would therefore generate energy. And so you look at this thing, you don't know what it is, but you see that it is a device in which water moves and generates power. So you would say that, well, functionally, this is a power producer, in this instance a dam, but if you had no idea what it was, you would start describing it based on what it does. You can't ignore the fact, the brute fact, that this structure exists. Then try to figure out what it is based on what it does. Kant takes this approach with the mind. The mind, consciousness, the self, these exist as brute force. You cannot deny, for Kant, that they exist. How do we describe them? Well, we go by what they do. We go by the functions that we see them perform. The consciousness for Kant is really about receiving information through the senses, right? Sight, sound, touch. You see your world, and your mind must be wired in such a way to be able to receive those sensations, which would be your base consciousness. What would then be the self for Kant? Well, the self is, interesting enough, an extension of Descartes in a way, where the self turns into this unifying narrative for all of the perceptions that have been received through consciousness, or the manifold of consciousness. When Kant is talking about the manifold, Kant is talking about the methods or the means by which external stimuli are perceived. So our eyes, our ears, our nose, our skin, those all receive sensation. The manifold of our consciousness would then be receiving all of these inputs, and without some anchor grounding the reception of all those inputs, it would just be nonsense. There would be no existence. And so of necessity, it's absolutely the case that some unifying self must exist in order to even make sense of it all. You can think of the self as a narrative structure that the mind creates in order to give meaning to all of the perceptions that are coming in. It gets much more complex than that, but this is a lengthy summarization of like a 4-inch thick book. You don't want to get into it. For Kant, essentially, the self and the mind exist because we experience it. And so because we experience it, there must be some way to describe it. You can't ignore the fact that we experience some form of self. But it's not really identified how this self arises. Or it must exist because I experience it. When you really break it down, the difference between Kant and Descartes, where Descartes would say, I think, therefore I am, Kant would say, I am, therefore I think. With Kant, existence precedes the self, or existence is necessary for the ability to have a self. But ultimately, I'm going to argue that this should instead be, I speak, therefore I am. What both Descartes and Kant fail to address is the role of language in the formation of the self. I want to clearly define how I'll be using the terms consciousness and the self before getting too much further into this. Consciousness is the ability of the mind to perceive its surroundings. I would say all life, plants and koalas included, has consciousness because they have the ability for sensorial inputs. Humans exist at this level constantly. And the French philosopher Sartre has a really compelling example of this. In Transcendence of the Ego, he describes a situation most of us have been in. You're sitting on the bus, and while you're between stops, you watch a passerby and the landscape out the window. You feel the weight in your seat. You sweat a little bit because it's hot. You hear the hustle and bustle of the other people on the bus. And in all of this experience, you do not have a single thought in your head, and you do not exist. There is no I in that moment or active narration of your actions. You just now became aware of yourself because I told you that you're aware of yourself. You just now became aware that you're listening to me drone on about this. So where were you before I brought your attention to yourself? That is your base consciousness. The self would be the I that is brought up only after switching over to active thinking, like you would do when you're remembering what you did today. Consciousness is experience, not thought. The self is thought, not experience. The self is reserved for me only for the highest order of animals, humans, maybe dolphins and orcas. What can I say? I'm a mammalian chauvinist. Now with that out of the way, here's my critique of Descartes and Kant. Descartes runs down to what he believes to be the most fundamental truth in his meditation, but puts too much emphasis on the self. I think therefore I am doesn't hold much water once you open your eyes and see the world around you. An ant exists. Or is am? Does it have an ego to speak of? Well, he may have only been talking about humans. What about people in a coma or a vegetative state? They don't puff out of existence with the absence of a sense of self. But am I conflating terms here? What does they even mean? Of course the physical body remains. Would that mean then that consciousness and the self are separate from the body? The body of someone in a vegetative state may remain, but they're not there in the colloquially meaningful sense. Regardless, existence can't be denied of them just because they no longer possess an obvious sense of self. If we assume Descartes is talking about the soul, where the soul is some eternal existing thing separate from the body but contained within it, which we have to because he believed the soul actually vibrated the pineal gland in the brain, which would then communicate its intent to the corporeal form, then we would need to give him his due that yes, a person in some form of vegetative state isn't currently experiencing or thinking. But what happens when we have someone in a non-vegetative state that does not possess a sense of self? Do they exist? Kant gets closer to my vision of self by positing existence as the prerequisite for the self and his acceptance of the brute facts of human existence. Humans perceive their surroundings and create a sense of self as a narrative device for ordering and anchoring those experiences. Where Kant contribute further is in the event that someone's perception is limited. He doesn't take into account all possible modes of human existence, such as someone who is blind, deaf, can't smell, can't feel, or any and all combinations of these. The unanswered question would be whether a lack of senses would translate into a diminishing of the self. Obviously, we wouldn't say a blind person has any less a sense of self than a person who can see, but at what point do we decide a person can't develop a sense of self? How many senses can you lose before you can't interact with your environment? I want to pull them into Descartes' thought experiment for a second and ask if someone born in a sensory deprivation tank and lived in there until adulthood, could they ever develop a sense of self? With no sensorial inputs, would you even be able to think? Granted, now I'm talking out of both sides of my mouth because on the one hand I say Descartes is too abstract while criticizing Kant for not abstracting enough, but I do this because the theory needs to be robust, meaning it has to work at all extremes of a spectrum of possibility. Imagine if addition only worked between the numbers 5 and 50. After that, you'd have to use some other system to help you account for the rest of the numbers. You could get pretty far in life not being able to add any numbers outside of that range, but it wouldn't be a complete theory. In the case of the self, our extremes on the spectrum are 1. A person that has all sense but no self, and 2. A person with no sense and a self. A person with no senses and a self is really hard to perceive. From a naturalistic perspective, I posit that consciousness is built into the structure of the brain in the form of neural relays that translate sensorial inputs into electricity. Funny enough, the answer to this would be the same as the answer to the question, if a tree falls in the forest and no one's there to hear it, does it make a noise? Well, of course the answer is yes. So in the case that someone is devoid of the ability to perceive their surroundings in any way, they would still innately have the capacity to experience stimuli, but never the opportunity to do so. However, without any stimuli for the consciousness to experience, what would the self then reflect upon? I conclude that a person with no senses and a self could not possibly exist by definition because the self is a self-referential phenomenon as a tool to organize conscious experience. With no conscious experience, there is no self. I don't see this as causing any tension with Descartes nor Kant's accounts. The more interesting extreme, and actually feasible example, would be what explains a person with all of their sensorial faculties but no sense of self. Feral children are a tragic phenomenon, most commonly a result of some sick, twisted individual's severe abuse. I don't bring them up lightly. A hallmark of feral children is their animalistic behavior, hence the feral moniker. They're unable to speak or interact with others in a meaningful way, but they are in possession of all of their faculties. The children who are rescued are never able to integrate back into society. What prohibits them from learning language? What is the limitation to their development once they have been removed from the abusive environment? One could argue that severe amount of abuse and trauma they must have endured would have left them more than likely mentally handicapped, thereby causing the problems we see. I'll concede that as a possibility. But what about feral children who were literally raised in the wild, raised by wolves? They wouldn't have the same trauma or abuse or innate handicap that would prevent them from reintegration, and yet we see the same issues of not being able to learn a language, not being able to interact with others, and failure to thrive in society. Their senses are intact, so from a Kantian perspective, their sense of self should magically manifest, which it doesn't. They don't have a sense of self, so from a Cartesian perspective, they shouldn't exist, but they clearly do. We can finally get to the title of the video. Language is necessary in the development of the self. Language is the missing link that would answer the extreme scenarios I have presented. Consciousness exists at the development of the brain. Consciousness is always present in receiving inputs from the environment. The sensorial stimuli are insufficient at creating a sense of self as evidenced by feral children. The self doesn't manifest itself magically once a threshold of inputs has been surpassed, and the self doesn't diminish when the senses are stripped away. As long as there is some external stimulus being perceived, a sense of self can emerge. Helen Keller comes to mind. External stimuli are a necessary component of the formation of the self, but not exhaustive, meaning you can put all the gas you want into your car, but without an engine it won't run. The self doesn't exist in a vacuum, like Descartes would conclude either. The self only manifests once it has the structure to form itself, and that structure is language. Even being able to say, "I think, therefore I am," requires the use of language. Language is the means by which a unifying narrative is possible for Kant. Yet both of these philosophers ignore the utility and power of language in the formation of the self. The feral children could never learn language, therefore they never develop their sense of self. The capacity to learn language is innate to our brains, and there's a critical window in which a person can learn language, and once that window is shut, you cannot progress. What are the implications of this? Well, interestingly enough, cognitive behavioral therapy, or CBT, enters the discussion here. CBT is a treatment method for people suffering from things like depression and anxiety, where the central thesis is that these issues are a result of maladaptive behaviors, and these maladaptive behaviors can be learned and unlearned. The way to unlearn maladaptive behaviors? Replace them with beneficial behaviors. And the mechanism of achieving this is through changing the way you talk about yourself. When you tell yourself you're not good enough, when you tell yourself all of the things that could go wrong in a certain scenario, the evidence shows that all you literally need to do is just tell yourself the opposite. That you are good enough, that everything is gonna work out. The evidence is clear that this actually works as well as medication and other invasive treatments. The extension of this, then, is that our self isn't defined. Our self isn't actually plastic, malleable. You're not bound by, I am who I'm meant to be. You're not stuck as you are. As you change your language, you change yourself in a meaningful sense. Language is such a powerful tool and is actually the necessary tool in the development of the self, and it goes unnoticed. As you use language differently, your sense of self manifests differently. Fake it until you make it. Well, that actually works, and if you're faking it with language, then you can manifest what you are talking about as in regards to yourself. You're not going to grow wings and fly. Now, what the heck does that have to do with Chants of Sennaar? I don't know, but the idea of learning language, interacting with others, just got me thinking on this, and I just couldn't put this thought down. I had to keep working on it. In conclusion, sounds very high school of me, I define language as being the necessary component of the development of the self. The self is only possible once language has been applied. Language forms the scaffolding upon which the self organizes and manifests. And if you change the scaffolding, you change that structure by changing your language, you change yourself. Senses aren't sufficient in manifesting the self. The self is not innate. The self just doesn't exist like Descartes would say. The self is manifested upon the learning of language. Now, thank you all for staying this long with me. This is my first attempt at something like this, and I'm gonna be a little more frank here than I will be in my future videos, but this is just really fun for me, and it's something that I've really wanted to do, and I'm gonna keep doing this just because I have fun with it, and I hope you have a great time with it too. Please like and subscribe, all of that other YouTube BS, but look for monthly uploads from me. I want to be doing this regularly, so stay tuned for what's coming up in the future, and thank you for joining me in Gamer Chair Philosophy.
Blah!